Crimson Sunset Reward. Winona Winnie Tate had everything, but she yearned for adventure, so she disguised herself as a ranch hand and found work with Travis Boone, a hardened cowboy. He watched her struggle with a rope, amused. "You sure you know what you're doing, son?" he murmured. "Or are you playing at something else?" Chapter 1. The Whispers of a Restless Wind. The wind carried a restless whisper through the manicured gardens of the Tate estate, a sound that mimicked the turmoil in Winona Tate's heart. From the outside, her life appeared to be a portrait of perfection. 24 years old, heiress to a cattle empire that stretched across 3 states, her days should have been filled with the frivolous pursuits expected of a woman of her station. Balls, teas, and the careful consideration of eligible suitors. But the silk dresses felt like shackles, the polite conversation a stifling cage. She stood on the veranda, the sprawling vista of manicured lawns and imported rose bushes a stark contrast to the untamed landscape she yearned for. Her father, a titan of industry with a heart as weathered as the leather of his favorite saddle, was inside, undoubtedly poring over ledgers and contracts, the air thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the weight of his expectations. He loved her, in his own gruff way, but he saw her as another asset, a piece to be strategically placed in the grand game of their family's legacy. Winona, or Winnie as only her closest childhood friend, Martha, dared call her, traced the delicate embroidery on her sleeve, the threads feeling strangely foreign against her skin. She'd always felt different. While other girls her age dreamt of grand weddings and Parisian gowns, Winnie had devoured dime novels about the Wild West, tales of daring outlaws and courageous women who forged their own paths in a land ruled by grit and resilience. The stories resonated with a longing deep within her, a hunger for something more than the gilded cage she inhabited. The restlessness had been growing, a persistent hum beneath the surface of her carefully constructed composure. It had started as a subtle dissatisfaction, a whisper in the back of her mind, but now it roared like a prairie fire, threatening to consume her. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The endless cycle of social engagements, the suffocating expectations, the pressure to marry a man chosen for his lineage rather than his heart, it was all becoming unbearable. The decision had come to her in the dead of night, a sudden, fierce clarity that cut through the fog of her discontent. She would leave. Not permanently, not to abandon her family, but to find herself, to breathe the air of freedom, even if only for a little while. It was a reckless, impulsive plan, born of desperation and a yearning for something authentic. She'd spent the past few weeks secretly preparing, squirreling away provisions, practicing her boyish walk in the privacy of her vast bedroom, and studying the rough and tumble slang she gleaned from those forbidden novels. She'd even dared to cut her long, raven hair, the silken strands falling to the floor like fallen tears, a tangible symbol of her shedding the life she was leaving behind. The short, choppy style felt strangely liberating, even as a pang of sadness echoed through her. The disguise was far from perfect. Her hands, though calloused from secret writing lessons, were still too soft, her skin too fair. Her voice, despite her best efforts to lower it, retained a hint of refinement. But she was determined. She had to try. Her plan was simple, audacious, and utterly terrifying. She would travel west, under the guise of a young man seeking work on a ranch. She'd chosen the name Will, a nod to her own unwavering will, and had crafted a flimsy backstory about a family lost to fever, a common enough tragedy in those harsh times. She knew it was a gamble, a dangerous one, but the thought of continuing her current existence felt like a slow, agonizing death. She'd chosen the Boone Ranch, a vast spread of land in the heart of Texas, known for its rugged terrain and even more rugged owner, Travis Boone. He was a legend in those parts, a man who had carved a life out of the unforgiving landscape, his reputation preceding him like a dust storm on the horizon. He was known for his unwavering principles, his sharp eyes that missed nothing, and his intolerance for fools. Winnie knew that if she could fool him, she could fool anyone. The journey itself was a blur of dusty roads, crowded stagecoaches, and the constant, gnawing fear of discovery. She kept to herself, observing the other passengers, learning their mannerisms, trying to blend in. The vastness of the landscape, the endless expanse of sky, both terrified and exhilarated her. It was a world away from the manicured gardens and stifling parlors of her former life. She arrived in the small, dusty town of Redemption, the closest settlement to the Boone Ranch, feeling a mixture of trepidation and excitement. The town was a collection of weathered buildings, a saloon dominating the main street, its doors swinging open to reveal a glimpse of a dimly lit interior and the sounds of raucous laughter and clinking glasses. The air smelled of dust, horses, and something else, something indefinable, a scent of wildness that both intrigued and intimidated her. She found a small, relatively clean boarding house, its owner, a woman named Mrs. Gable, eyeing her with a mixture of suspicion and weary acceptance. Winnie, as Will, paid for a week's lodging, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was small, sparsely furnished, but it felt like a palace compared to the cramped confines of the stagecoach. The next morning, under the pale light of dawn, she set out for the Boone Ranch. The ride was long and arduous, the landscape growing increasingly wild and untamed. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the dust coated her throat, making her cough. Doubts began to creep in, whispering insidious questions in her ear. Was she truly cut out for this? Could she maintain the charade? What if she was discovered? As she crested a rise, the Boone Ranch spread out before her. A vast expanse of rolling hills and grazing cattle, the ranch house itself a sturdy, sprawling structure that seemed to grow organically from the land. It was a sight that both awed and intimidated her. This was it. There was no turning back now. She urged her rented horse, a tired-looking mare named Bess, forward, her hands tightening on the reins. As she approached the main house, she saw a figure emerge from the barn, a tall, lean man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to pierce through her disguise. It was Travis Boone. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable, his stance radiating a quiet, contained power. Winnie swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. She dismounted, trying to mimic the casual swagger she'd observed in other men, and approached him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She offered a hesitant nod, her voice deliberately low and rough. "Mornin'," she mumbled, avoiding his gaze. "Heard you might be needin' a hand." Travis Boone studied her for a long, silent moment, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. He watched her struggle slightly with the rope she'd been attempting to coil, a faint flicker of amusement playing on his lips. "You sure you know what you're doin', son?" he murmured, his voice a low, resonant drawl that sent a shiver down her spine, a shiver that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something she couldn't quite name. "Or are you playin' at something else?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken suspicion. Winnie's carefully constructed facade threatened to crumble. This was the moment of truth, the beginning of her gamble. The whisper of the wind seemed to mock her, a reminder of the life she'd left behind and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Chapter 2. Shadows and silk beneath the sun. The sun beat down on Winnie's back, the heat radiating through the rough spun shirt she wore, a stark contrast to the cool silks she was accustomed to. Boone's question lingered in the air, a tangible weight pressing down on her. She forced herself to meet his gaze, trying to project an air of confidence she didn't feel. "I can handle myself, Mr. Boone," she replied, her voice a little steadier this time, though the slight tremor that remained betrayed her nervousness. She hoped he'd chalk it up to a young man's apprehension in the face of a seasoned rancher. "I may not be as experienced as some, but I'm a quick learner, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Boone continued to study her, his eyes, the color of weathered leather, narrowed in scrutiny. He circled her slowly, like a predator assessing its prey, taking in every detail: the two soft hands, the slight frame, the way she held herself, a subtle stiffness that hinted at a life far removed from the dusty plains of Texas. He'd seen greenhorns before, plenty of them, young men drawn to the romanticized notion of the West, only to be broken by its harsh realities. But there was something different about this one, something that didn't quite fit. "Where are you from, Will?" he asked, his voice deceptively casual, but Winnie knew this was a test. She recited the story she'd rehearsed countless times, her voice carefully devoid of emotion. "Lost my folks to fever a few years back. Been driftin' ever since, talking odd jobs here and there." She paused, adding a touch of practiced weariness to her tone. "Heard there was work to be had in these parts." Boone didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on a distant point on the horizon, as if weighing her words against some unseen scale. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the buzzing of insects and the distant lowing of cattle. Winnie fought the urge to fidget, to break the uncomfortable quiet. She knew that any sign of weakness, any hint of deception, would be her undoing. Finally, he turned back to her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "We'll see," he said, his voice noncommittal. "Can you ride?" It was a simple question, but Winnie knew it was another test. She'd spent countless hours in the saddle, secretly practicing on the sprawling grounds of the Tate estate, honing her skills under the watchful eye of the old stable master, a grizzled veteran who had taught her father to ride. She was a skilled horsewoman, but she had to temper her expertise, to appear competent but not overly proficient. "Passable," she replied, with a shrug. "I ain't no rodeo star, but I can stay on a horse." Boone nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "Good. We'll start you in the stables. Mucking out stalls, feeding the horses, that sort of thing. It ain't glamorous, but it's honest work." Winnie swallowed her disappointment. She'd hoped for something more challenging, something that would allow her to prove her worth, but she knew she had to start somewhere. She nodded, trying to appear grateful for the opportunity. "Sounds good to me, Mr. Boone." He led her towards the stables, a large, weathered structure that smelled of hay, horses, and sweat. The air inside was cooler, a welcome respite from the scorching sun. Several ranch hands were already at work, their movements practiced and efficient, their bodies hardened by years of labor. They glanced at Winnie with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, their eyes lingering on her slight frame and unfamiliar face. Boone introduced her briefly, his voice devoid of warmth or encouragement. "This is Will. He'll be helpin' out around here. Show him the ropes." The other hands nodded, their expressions noncommittal. Winnie felt a wave of isolation wash over her, a sense of being an outsider, a pretender in a world where authenticity was paramount. She knew she had a long way to go to earn their trust, to prove that she belonged. The work was grueling, harder than anything she'd ever experienced. The stench of manure, the heavy lifting, the endless repetition, it was a far cry from the pampered life she'd known. Her muscles ached, her hands blistered, and her back screamed in protest. But she persevered, driven by a stubborn determination to prove herself, to succeed in this charade she'd created. She watched the other hands, studying their movements, learning their routines. She asked questions, carefully phrasing them to avoid revealing her ignorance, and listened intently to their answers. She learned the names of the horses, their temperaments, their quirks. She learned how to saddle a horse properly, how to clean a stall efficiently, how to mend a broken fence. Slowly, grudgingly, the other hands began to accept her. They still treated her with a certain degree of caution, but the initial hostility faded, replaced by a wary respect. They saw her willingness to work, her determination to learn, her refusal to complain, even when her body screamed for rest. But Travis Boone remained an enigma. He rarely spoke to her directly, his presence a constant, watchful shadow. He observed her from afar, his eyes missing nothing, his expression unreadable. Winnie couldn't tell if he suspected her, or if he was simply testing her, pushing her to her limits to see if she would break. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Winnie found herself alone in the stables, tending to a horse with a minor injury. She was exhausted, her body aching, her mind weary. She sat down on a bale of hay, her head in her hands, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation. She missed her family, her friends, the familiar comforts of her old life. She missed the soft sheets, the warm baths, the delicious meals. She missed the ease of being herself, of not having to constantly guard her every word, her every gesture. A tear slipped down her cheek, followed by another and another. She quickly wiped them away, ashamed of her weakness. She couldn't afford to break down, not now, not when she was so close to proving herself. She heard a sound behind her, a soft footfall on the straw-covered floor. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat, expecting to see one of the other hands. But it was Travis Boone. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light, his face in shadow. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching her. Winnie felt a wave of panic wash over her. Had he seen her crying? Had he discovered her secret? The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Winnie held her breath, waiting for him to speak, to expose her, to send her away. But he didn't. He simply turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the night. Winnie let out a shaky breath, her heart still pounding. She didn't know what to make of his silence. Was it a sign of compassion? Or simply indifference? She had no answers, only the growing certainty that her journey was far from over, and that the shadows beneath the sun held secrets far deeper than she could have imagined. The wind whispered through the open stable door, a haunting melody that mirrored the uncertainty in her heart. Chapter 3. Boone's Grudging Gaze. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, a relentless cycle of physical labor under the watchful, and often unsettling, gaze of Travis Boone. Winnie, still disguised as Will, found a strange comfort in the routine. The work, though backbreaking, offered a distraction from the constant fear of discovery, a way to lose herself in the physicality of the tasks at hand. She learned to anticipate Boone's movements, to sense his presence even before she saw him. He was a man of few words, but his eyes spoke volumes. They were eyes that had seen too much, eyes that held a deep-seated weariness, yet still sparkled with an undeniable intensity. He seemed to be perpetually assessing her, weighing her worth, probing for weaknesses. One sweltering afternoon, Winnie was tasked with repairing a section of broken fence line, the sun beating down mercilessly on her back. The wood was warped and splintered, the nails rusted and stubborn. She struggled with the hammer, her hands, still soft despite the calluses that were beginning to form, clumsy and awkward. She heard the familiar crunch of boots on gravel and looked up to see Boone approaching, his long strides eating up the distance between them. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her, offering a momentary respite from the scorching sun. He didn't speak, just watched her struggle, his expression unreadable. Winnie felt a flush of frustration rise in her cheeks. She knew she was making a mess of it, her movements far from the smooth efficiency of the other ranch hands. "Need a hand?" Boone finally asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the dry air. Winnie hesitated. Pride warred with practicality. She wanted to prove she could handle it herself, but she also knew she was wasting time and energy. I think I've got it," she mumbled, her voice lacking conviction. Boone raised a skeptical eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. He didn't argue, didn't offer any further assistance. He simply stood there, watching her, his presence a silent challenge. Winnie gritted her teeth and continued to wrestle with the fence, her frustration mounting with each missed swing of the hammer. Finally, with a muttered curse, she slammed the hammer down on the ground, her hand throbbing. Boone stepped forward, his movements fluid and graceful. He picked up the hammer, his large, calloused hand dwarfing hers, and with a few deft strokes, he had the nail driven straight and true. He continued to work, his movements precise and economical, making the task look effortless. Winnie watched him, her cheeks burning with a mixture of shame and admiration. She was struck by the contrast between them, his strength and competence versus her own awkwardness and inexperience. It was a stark reminder of the vast gulf that separated them, not just in terms of skill, but in terms of their entire lives. "There's a knack to it," Boone said, his voice surprisingly gentle, as he finished the repair. He handed her the hammer, his fingers brushing hers, sending an unexpected jolt through her. Don't try to force it. Let the hammer do the work. Winnie took the hammer, her hand trembling slightly. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment, she saw something other than suspicion in his gaze. There was a flicker of understanding, perhaps even a hint of respect. "Thank you," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. Boone nodded, his expression softening slightly. "You'll learn," he said, his voice devoid of its usual harshness. "Just takes time and practice." He turned to leave, but then paused, as if struck by a sudden thought. "You remind me of someone," he said, his voice thoughtful, his eyes searching hers. "Can't quite place who." Winnie's heart skipped a beat. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Had he seen through her disguise? Was he toying with her? She forced a nervous laugh, trying to deflect his attention. "Must be my rugged good looks," she quipped, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. Boone didn't smile. He continued to study her, his eyes narrowed in thought. Then, with a shrug, he turned and walked away, leaving Winnie shaken and unnerved. The incident left her deeply unsettled. Boone's words, his searching gaze, had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. She began to wonder if he suspected more than he let on, if he was playing a game with her, waiting for her to slip up, to reveal her true identity. The fear of discovery, which had been a constant undercurrent, now surged to the surface, threatening to overwhelm her. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, her senses on high alert, her nerves stretched taut. She started to avoid Boone as much as possible, seeking out tasks that kept her away from the main house, from his watchful eyes. But it was impossible to avoid him entirely. He was the owner of the ranch, his presence woven into the very fabric of the place. And despite her fear, there was a part of her, a small, rebellious part, that was drawn to him. She found herself fascinated by his quiet strength, his unwavering principles, the hint of vulnerability that she sometimes glimpsed beneath his hardened exterior. It was a dangerous fascination, one that she knew she couldn't afford to indulge, but she couldn't seem to help herself. The wind, a constant companion, carried a scent to her leather, horses, and something indefinably him, a reminder of the man who held her fate in his hands, and perhaps something more. The sun set, casting long shadows, and Winnie wondered if those shadows would ever truly disappear. Chapter 4. The Weight of Unspoken Truths. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on Winnie, a heavy burden that grew heavier with each passing day. She found herself increasingly isolated, trapped between the persona she had created and the reality of who she was. The other ranch hands, while accepting of her presence, remained distant, their conversations often ceasing abruptly when she approached. She was an outsider, a pretender, and the loneliness gnawed at her. She found solace in the horses, in the quiet companionship of the animals. They didn't judge her, didn't question her, didn't care about her past or her secrets. She spent hours in the stables, grooming them, talking to them in hushed tones, finding a measure of peace in their gentle presence. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Winnie was tending to a mare named Belle, a beautiful chestnut with a gentle disposition. Belle had been acting strangely, restless and agitated, and Winnie was worried about her. She stroked the mare's soft coat, murmuring soothing words, trying to calm her. She heard a footstep behind her and turned, expecting to see one of the other hands. But it was Boone. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading light, his face in shadow. "She's not herself," he said, his voice low and quiet, his gaze fixed on the mare. Winnie nodded, her heart beating a little faster. "I don't know what's wrong with her. She seems unsettled." Boone stepped closer, his eyes scanning the mare with a practiced gaze. He ran his hand along her flank, his touch gentle and sure. Belle nuzzled against him, her agitation seeming to subside. "She's just missing her foal," Boone said, his voice surprisingly soft. "It was weaned a few weeks ago. She'll get over it, but it takes time." Winnie felt a pang of sympathy for the mare, a feeling that resonated with her own sense of loss and displacement. She knew what it was like to be separated from those you loved, to feel the ache of absence. "It must be hard," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Boone looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "It is," he said, his voice heavy with unspoken emotion. "But life goes on. You learn to adapt, to find a way to carry on." His words struck a chord deep within her. He was talking about more than just the mare, she realized. He was talking about his own life, his own losses. She sensed a deep well of sadness within him, a pain that he kept carefully hidden beneath his stoic exterior. For a moment, they stood in silence, the only sound the soft breathing of the horses and the chirping of crickets outside. Winnie felt a connection to him, a shared understanding of the burdens they both carried. I know what it's like to lose someone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She hadn't intended to reveal anything about herself, but the words slipped out, propelled by a sudden need for honesty. Boone's gaze intensified, his eyes probing hers. "You do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Winnie hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't reveal her true identity, but she couldn't lie, not to him, not now. I lost my family," she said, choosing her words carefully. "A long time ago. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was close enough." She had lost a part of her family, the life she had known, the future she had expected. Boone nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice genuine. "I know that pain." He didn't ask for details, didn't press her for more information. He simply accepted her statement, her unspoken grief. And in that moment, Winnie felt a sense of relief, a lightening of the burden she had been carrying. He turned back to the mare, stroking her coat, his touch gentle and reassuring. "She'll be all right," he said, his voice regaining its usual composure. "Just needs a little time." He looked at Winnie again, a hint of warmth in his eyes. "You're good with her," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You have a way with animals." It was a small compliment, but it meant the world to Winnie. It was the first genuine praise he had given her, the first sign that he saw her as something more than just a hired hand, a pretender. He left the stables then, leaving Winnie alone with the mare. But the silence felt different now, less lonely, less oppressive. The weight of unspoken truths remained, but it felt a little lighter, a little easier to bear. The moon, a sliver in the vast, dark sky, seemed to offer a silent promise of something more, something she couldn't yet define, but felt nonetheless. The wind whispered a secret, and for the first time, it sounded like hope. Chapter 5. Scars Beneath the Starlight. The vast Texas sky, a canvas of endless stars, offered a stark contrast to the close, shadowed confines of Winnie's anxieties. She'd taken to spending her evenings outside, seeking solace in the immensity of the landscape, the quiet hum of the night. It was a way to escape, however briefly, the constant pressure of her disguise, the ever-present fear of Boone's scrutiny. One night, after the other hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Winnie found herself drawn to the corral, where the horses were gathered, their dark shapes silhouetted against the starlight. She leaned against the fence, watching them, listening to their soft nickers and the rustling of their tails. She heard a footstep behind her and turned, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Boone. He stood a few feet away, his face partially obscured by shadow, his eyes gleaming in the faint light. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching her, his presence both unsettling and strangely comforting. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to blend with the sounds of the night. Winnie shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No." "Too much on my mind." He nodded as if understanding. He stepped closer, leaning against the fence beside her, their shoulders almost touching. The silence stretched between them, comfortable, yet charged with an unspoken tension. "This land, it has a way of doing that," he said, his voice thoughtful, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Makes you think. Makes you remember." Winnie glanced at him, her curiosity piqued. "Remember what?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He hesitated, as if weighing his words. "Everything," he said, his voice heavy with unspoken emotion. "The good, the bad, the things you'd rather forget. He turned to look at her, his eyes searching hers. We all have scars, Will, he said, his voice a low murmur. Some are visible, some are hidden, but they're all a part of who we are. Winnie felt a shiver run down her spine. His words resonated with her own hidden scars, the emotional wounds she carried beneath her disguise. She wondered what scars he carried, what pain he kept hidden beneath his stoic exterior. She looked away, unable to hold his gaze. I don't like to talk about the past, she mumbled, her voice barely audible. He didn't press her, didn't push for details. He simply nodded, respecting her silence. The past is always with us, he said, his voice gentle. But it doesn't have to define us. We can choose to move forward, to find a new path. His words offered a glimmer of hope, a reminder that she wasn't alone in her struggles. She had made a choice, a reckless, impulsive choice, to leave her past behind, to forge a new path. But the past still clung to her, a shadow that followed her every step. She looked up at the stars, their brilliance a stark contrast to the darkness that surrounded her. She wondered if she would ever truly be free from the shadows, if she would ever find the peace she so desperately craved. Sometimes I feel like I'm running from something, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. But I don't even know what it is. Boone turned to her, his eyes filled with a depth of understanding that surprised her. Maybe you're not running from something, he said, his voice soft. Maybe you're running towards something. His words struck a chord deep within her. She had always thought of her journey as an escape, a flight from her old life. But perhaps he was right. Perhaps she was also searching for something she hadn't yet found, something that lay hidden in the vast, untamed landscape of the West. He reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly over hers, before gently covering it. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. His hand was warm and rough, a stark contrast to her own soft skin, a reminder of the different worlds they inhabited. Don't be afraid to look for it, Will, he said, his voice a low murmur, his gaze intense. Whatever it is. He withdrew his hand, the warmth lingering on her skin. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone beneath the starlit sky. His words echoed in her mind, a challenge, an invitation, a promise of something more. She looked up at the stars, their brilliance seeming to pierce through the darkness, illuminating a path she hadn't seen before. The scars remained, but beneath them, a flicker of hope began to grow, fueled by the vastness of the night and the unexpected connection she had found with a man who carried his own hidden wounds. The wind whispered secrets, and for the first time, Winnie felt a glimmer of courage, a willingness to face the unknown, to embrace the possibility of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. Chapter 6. Echoes of a Gilded Cage. Despite the growing connection with Boone, the echoes of Winnie's former life continued to haunt her. The gilded cage she had escaped might be miles away, but its bars still cast shadows on her present. Memories, triggered by the smallest things, a particular scent, a certain phrase, a glimpse of the moon reflecting on a water trough would surface, reminding her of the world she had left behind. One day, a letter arrived from her father. It had been forwarded from her family's estate, its journey across the country a testament to her father's relentless reach. She recognized his strong, precise handwriting on the envelope, and her heart clenched with a mixture of guilt and longing. She retreated to the privacy of her small room in the boarding house, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. She hesitated for a long moment, staring at the familiar script, before finally tearing it open. The letter was brief, formal, and devoid of any outward emotion. He wrote of business matters, of the upcoming cattle drive, of the social events she was missing. He mentioned a potential suitor, a wealthy banker from back east, who had expressed a keen interest in her. He urged her to return home, to fulfill her duties, to take her rightful place in society. There was no mention of worry, no hint of concern for her well-being. It was as if she were simply a misplaced asset, a piece of property that needed to be retrieved. Winnie felt a surge of anger, followed by a wave of sadness. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that her absence would have elicited a different response, a sign that her father cared for her as a person, not just as an heiress. She crumpled the letter in her hand, her frustration mounting. She wanted to scream, to shout, to rail against the expectations that had suffocated her for so long. But she couldn't. She was Will, the ranch hand, the drifter. She had to maintain the charade, to suppress her true feelings. She threw the letter into the small, rusty stove that provided the room's only heat, watching as the flames consumed the paper, turning it to ash. It was a symbolic act, a futile attempt to erase the past, to sever the ties that bound her. But the echoes remained, the memories swirling around her like dust devils in the wind. She remembered the lavish balls, the suffocating dresses, the endless parade of suitors, each one more boring and predictable than the last. She remembered the feeling of being trapped, of being a pawn in her father's grand game. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the images, but they persisted, relentless and vivid. She saw herself standing on the veranda of the Tate estate, looking out at the manicured gardens, yearning for something more. She saw herself riding through the open fields, her hair flying in the wind, feeling a sense of freedom she had never known before. She opened her eyes, her gaze falling on the small, cracked mirror that hung on the wall. She stared at her reflection, at the young man who stared back at her, a stranger with her eyes. It was a mask, a disguise, but it was also a shield, a protection against the world she had left behind. She touched her short, choppy hair, the rough texture a stark contrast to the silken strands she had once possessed. She traced the lines of her face, hardened by the sun and wind, the subtle changes that had transformed her from a pampered society girl into a weathered ranch hand. She wondered if she would ever be able to reconcile the two halves of her identity, the heiress and the imposter. She wondered if she would ever be able to find a place where she truly belonged, a place where she could be herself, without fear of judgment or expectation. The sound of horses' hooves outside the window drew her attention. She looked out and saw Boone riding towards the ranch house, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He looked strong and confident, a man who belonged in this harsh, unforgiving landscape. She felt a pang of longing, a desire for something she couldn't quite define. She wanted to be like him, to be free from the constraints of her past, to live a life of purpose and meaning. But she knew she couldn't, not yet. She still had a role to play, a secret to keep. She turned away from the window, her heart heavy with unspoken emotions. The echoes of the gilded cage remained, but they were fainter now, drowned out by the sounds of the west, by the whispers of the wind, by the growing presence of a man who seemed to see beyond her disguise, to the woman she was trying to become. The setting sun cast long shadows, but within those shadows, a glimmer of hope persisted, a fragile flame that refused to be extinguished. Chapter 7. The Dance of Dust and Deception. Life on the Boone Ranch continued its demanding rhythm, but beneath the surface, a subtle shift was occurring. Winnie, as Will, found herself increasingly drawn into the intricate dance of ranch life, her initial awkwardness gradually giving way to a quiet competence. She learned to anticipate the needs of the horses, to read the subtle signs of the weather, to understand the unspoken language of the other hands. Boone, too, seemed to be changing, his initial suspicion of her slowly eroding, replaced by a grudging respect, and something more, something Winnie couldn't quite decipher, but felt nonetheless. He started to include her in more challenging tasks, assigning her responsibilities that required skill and judgment. He even began to seek her opinion on matters related to the horses, valuing her insights, her intuitive understanding of the animals. One afternoon, a fierce dust storm swept across the plains, a swirling vortex of sand and grit that blotted out the sun and reduced visibility to near zero. The cattle, spooked by the sudden darkness and howling wind, began to stampede, threatening to break through the fence line and scatter across the open range. Boone barked orders, his voice sharp and urgent, directing the hands to try and contain the panicked animals. Winnie found herself in the thick of it, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She rode alongside Boone, her horse, Bess, responding to her commands with a surprising agility, her own fear momentarily overshadowed by the adrenaline of the moment. The wind whipped around them, stinging their faces, filling their lungs with dust. The cattle surged and swayed, a chaotic mass of horns and hooves, their bellows echoing through the storm. Winnie fought to control her horse, to keep her balance, to avoid being trampled. She saw Boone, his face grim and determined, his eyes scanning the swirling dust, searching for a way to turn the herd. He shouted instructions to her, his voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. "Head them off at the pass," he yelled, pointing towards a narrow gap in the fence line. "Don't let them get through." Winnie nodded, her mind racing. It was a risky maneuver, a dangerous gamble, but she knew it was the only way to prevent a full-scale stampede. She spurred Bess forward, her horse responding instantly, her own fear replaced by a surge of adrenaline. She rode hard, her body low over the horse's neck, the wind whipping her hair, the dust blinding her eyes. She could barely see, barely breathe, but she kept going, driven by a fierce determination to succeed. She reached the pass just as the first wave of cattle thundered towards it. She positioned Bess squarely in their path, her own body a fragile barrier against the oncoming tide of animals. She yelled, waved her arms, anything to turn them back. For a moment, it seemed as if she would fail, as if the cattle would overrun her. But then, slowly, gradually, the herd began to turn, their momentum shifting, their direction changing. Winnie held her ground, her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling with exertion. She had done it. She had turned the herd. Boone rode up beside her, his face covered in dust, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and admiration. "Good work, Will," he said, his voice hoarse but genuine. "You saved the day." It was the highest praise he had ever given her, and it sent a wave of warmth through her, a feeling of accomplishment that transcended her disguise, her deception. As the storm began to subside, the dust settling, the sun breaking through the clouds, Winnie felt a sense of exhilaration, a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced before. She had faced a challenge, a real test of her courage and skill, and she had succeeded. But the exhilaration was short-lived. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of her situation returned, the constant fear of discovery, the weight of her unspoken truths. She had proven herself as Will, the ranch hand, but she was still Winnie, the heiress, living a lie. The dance of dust and deception continued, a delicate balance between her two identities, a constant struggle to maintain the charade. But the storm had changed something, had shifted the dynamics between her and Boone. He saw her differently now, not just as a hired hand, but as someone capable, someone courageous, someone he could rely on. And that, Winnie knew, was both a blessing and a curse. The sun, now setting, cast a golden glow on the landscape, a beauty that was both serene and deceptive, much like her own life at that moment. The wind, still carrying dust, whispered a warning, a reminder of the fragility of her charade. Chapter 8. A storm brewing on the horizon. The relative calm that followed the dust storm was deceptive. A lull before another, more insidious storm began to brew. Tensions on the ranch were rising, fueled by whispers of cattle rustling in the area, a threat that hung heavy in the air, casting a shadow over their daily lives. Boone, his face etched with worry, became even more withdrawn, his already taciturn nature deepening into a brooding silence. He spent hours poring over maps, consulting with the other hands, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, as if searching for a sign of the impending danger. Winnie observed him from afar, her heart aching for him, her concern growing with each passing day. She wanted to help, to offer some kind of support, but she knew she couldn't, not as Will. Her disguise, once a shield, now felt like a barrier, preventing her from reaching out to him, from offering the comfort she so desperately wanted to give. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of red and orange, Winnie found Boone standing alone by the corral, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. He looked weary, his shoulders slumped, his body radiating a sense of exhaustion. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She knew she was taking a risk, but she couldn't stand by and watch him struggle alone. She approached him slowly, her footsteps quiet on the dusty ground. "Mr. Boone?" she said, her voice hesitant, her tone carefully neutral. He turned, his eyes startled, as if he hadn't heard her approach. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "What is it, Will?" he asked, his voice weary. Winnie took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "I know you're worried about the rustlers," she said, her voice low and quiet. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Boone looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He seemed to be weighing her offer, assessing her sincerity. "It's a dangerous situation, Will," he said, his voice grave. "I don't want to put you at risk." Winnie met his gaze, her own eyes filled with determination. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice steady. "I can handle myself. I want to help." Boone studied her for a long moment, his expression softening slightly. He seemed to see something in her eyes, something that resonated with his own sense of responsibility, his own determination to protect his land, his livelihood. "All right," he said, his voice finally relenting. "I could use another pair of eyes. We'll be riding out at dawn, patrolling the perimeter. Be ready." Winnie nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and trepidation. She had been given a chance, an opportunity to prove her worth, to stand alongside Boone, to face the danger together. They rode out before dawn, the sky still dark, the air cool and crisp. The landscape was shrouded in shadows, the silence broken only by the sound of their horses' hooves and the occasional call of a night bird. They rode in silence, their senses on high alert, their eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of trouble. Winnie felt a sense of anticipation, a mixture of fear and excitement. As the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in pale hues of pink and gold, they reached a high ridge overlooking a vast expanse of grazing land. They stopped, their horses breathing heavily, their bodies tense. Boone raised his hand, signaling her to be silent. He pointed towards a distant point on the horizon, where a faint cloud of dust was rising. "Riders," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Looks like we found our trouble." Winnie felt a surge of adrenaline, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. The storm was about to break. She tightened her grip on the reins, her body ready for action. She looked at Boone, her eyes meeting his. She saw a flicker of something in his gaze, a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they faced, and a bond that was forming between them, forged in the crucible of the coming storm. The rising sun illuminated their faces, revealing a determination that transcended fear, a commitment to face whatever lay ahead, together. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of dust and danger, a prelude to the conflict that was about to unfold. Chapter 9. The Cracks in a Hardened Heart. The riders approached, their figures growing larger, their intentions clear. They were a rough-looking bunch, heavily armed, their faces obscured by bandanas, their eyes glinting with malice. Boone had been right, these were the rustlers. He turned to Winnie, his expression grim, his voice low and urgent. "Stay behind me, Will," he commanded, "and don't do anything foolish." Winnie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, but her resolve firm. She wouldn't cower, wouldn't run. She would stand by Boone, face whatever came. The rustlers, numbering around a dozen, reined in their horses a short distance away, their leader, a burly man with a scarred face and a cruel sneer, surveying them with disdain. Well, the leader drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look what we have here. Travis Boone himself, come to play hero." Boone didn't flinch, didn't back down. He met the leader's gaze, his own eyes cold and hard. "This is my land," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "And those are my cattle. Turn back now, and I'll let you live." The leader laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed across the plains.
You and what army, Boone?
He sneered. You're outnumbered, outgunned. You're finished. Boone didn't respond, his hand hovering near the rifle slung across his back. Winnie knew he was a skilled marksman, a deadly shot, but even he couldn't take on 12 men alone. She felt a surge of fear, a cold knot of dread in her stomach. But she also felt a surge of anger, a fierce determination to protect Boone, to defend the land she had come to care for. She subtly shifted her position, her hand moving towards the small pistol she had concealed beneath her shirt, a weapon she had secretly practiced with, preparing for a moment like this. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but she had to be ready. The tension stretched, taut and brittle, like a wire about to snap. The rustlers shifted restlessly, their hands moving towards their weapons. Boone remained still, his eyes locked on the leader, his body coiled, ready to spring. Suddenly, the leader spurred his horse forward, his hand reaching for his gun.
Kill them, he roared.
Boone reacted instantly, his rifle coming up, his shot ringing out, the bullet finding its mark. The leader tumbled from his horse, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Chaos erupted. The rustlers opened fire, their bullets whizzing through the air, kicking up dust around them. Boone returned fire, his shots precise and deadly. Winnie drew her pistol, her hand trembling slightly, but her aim true. She fired at the closest rustler, her bullet hitting him in the shoulder, knocking him from his horse. She continued to fire, her fear replaced by a cold, focused determination. She was fighting for her life, for Boone's life, for the life she had chosen. The battle was short, sharp, and brutal. The rustlers, surprised by Boone's ferocity and Winnie's unexpected resistance, quickly lost their nerve. Several of them were killed or wounded, the rest scattering, fleeing in disarray. Boone stood, his rifle smoking, his body tense, his eyes scanning the retreating figures. He turned to Winnie, his face covered in dust and sweat, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else. Something akin to awe. "You all right, Will?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Winnie nodded, her own body trembling with the aftermath of the adrenaline rush. She holstered her pistol, her hand still shaking. I think so," she stammered. Boone looked at her, his gaze intense, his expression softening. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers brushing away a smudge of dirt. "You were incredible," he said, his voice low and husky. "You saved my life." His words, his touch, sent a shiver through her, a feeling that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something she shouldn't, allow herself to feel. The cracks in Boone's hardened heart were beginning to show, the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself starting to crumble. He had seen a different side of Will, a courage and resilience he hadn't expected, a vulnerability that mirrored his own. And Winnie, in that moment, knew that her secret, her disguise, was becoming increasingly precarious. The line between Will and Winnie was blurring, the dance of deception becoming more and more dangerous. The setting sun cast long shadows, obscuring the true extent of the damage, both physical and emotional. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder and blood, a stark reminder of the violence that had just transpired and the even greater storm that was brewing within their hearts. Chapter 10. Whispers of Betrayal in the Wind. The aftermath of the gunfight left a heavy silence hanging over the ranch. While the immediate threat of the rustlers had been neutralized, a sense of unease lingered, a feeling that the conflict was far from over. Boone, though outwardly calm, was clearly shaken, his usual stoicism replaced by a restless energy. He doubled the patrols, tightened security, his every action reflecting a deep-seated concern. Winnie, too, was affected by the events. The adrenaline-fueled courage she had displayed during the fight had faded, leaving her feeling vulnerable and exposed. She had come close to death, had seen the brutality of the West firsthand, and it had shaken her to her core. But it wasn't just the violence that troubled her. It was Boone's reaction, his words of praise, his touch, the look in his eyes. It had stirred something within her, a feeling she had tried to suppress, a feeling that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. She found herself avoiding him, seeking out tasks that kept her away from the main house, from his intense gaze. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, that her feelings for him were a betrayal of her own deception, a threat to the carefully constructed facade she had created. One evening, as she was returning from a solitary ride, she overheard a conversation between two of the ranch hands, their voices low and conspiratorial. She wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but their words, carried on the wind, caught her attention. "I don't trust him," one of the hands said, his voice filled with suspicion. He's too good. Too quick with a gun. Too different." "I know what you mean," the other hand replied. "There's something not right about him. I heard Boone say he reminded him of someone from his past." "Maybe he's a spy," the first hand suggested. "Maybe he's working with the rustlers. Maybe he was sent here to betray Boone." Winnie's heart froze. Their words, though unfounded, struck a chord of fear within her. She was a spy in a way. She was living a lie. She was keeping secrets. She quickly moved away, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had to be more careful, more discreet. She couldn't afford to arouse suspicion, to give anyone a reason to doubt her. But the damage was done. The seeds of doubt had been planted, not just in the minds of the ranch hands, but in her own mind as well. She began to question her own motives, her own actions. Was she betraying Boone, even unintentionally? Was her presence on the ranch a danger to him? The thought tormented her, filling her with guilt and anxiety. She had come to care for Boone, to respect him, to admire him. The last thing she wanted to do was hurt him. She decided she had to be more vigilant, more observant. She had to uncover the truth behind the rustling, to find out who was behind it, to protect Boone, even if it meant risking her own exposure. She started to pay closer attention to the other hands, to their conversations, their movements. She noticed small things, subtle clues, that she had previously overlooked. She began to piece together a puzzle, a web of connections and suspicions. She discovered that one of the hands, a man named Jed, had been making frequent trips to town, often returning late at night, his pockets suspiciously full. She also learned that Jed had a history of gambling debts, a weakness that could easily be exploited. She suspected that Jed was involved with the rustlers, that he was providing them with information, helping them plan their raids. But she needed proof, concrete evidence that she could present to Boone. She knew it was a dangerous game, a risky undertaking. If she was wrong, she could be accused of slander, of betraying the trust of the other hands. But if she was right, she could save Boone's ranch, his livelihood, perhaps even his life. The wind, now carrying a chill, whispered a warning, a reminder of the stakes involved. She felt the eyes of suspicion on her, and she knew the time for truth was fast approaching. Chapter 11. The Price of Freedom's Call. Driven by a mixture of loyalty and a growing, undeniable affection for Boone, Winnie decided to take matters into her own hands. She knew the risks, the potential for exposure, but the thought of Boone being betrayed, of his ranch being destroyed, was unbearable. She had to act, even if it meant jeopardizing her own carefully constructed disguise. She began to follow Jed, shadowing him on his clandestine trips to town, observing his meetings, gathering evidence. It was a dangerous game, a cat and mouse chase that could have dire consequences if she were discovered. One night, she followed Jed to a secluded saloon on the outskirts of town, a dimly lit, smoke-filled establishment known for its rough clientele and illicit dealings. She watched from the shadows as Jed met with a group of men, their faces hidden by the darkness, their voices low and conspiratorial. She couldn't hear their exact words, but she could tell from their gestures, their body language, that they were planning something that involved Boone and his ranch. She saw Jed hand over a map, a detailed drawing of the ranch layout, including the location of the cattle, the water sources, the patrol routes. Winnie's heart sank. It was worse than she had feared. Jed wasn't just providing information, he was actively collaborating with the rustlers, helping them plan a major attack. She knew she had to get back to Boone, to warn him, but she also knew that she needed more concrete evidence, something that would prove Jed's treachery beyond a doubt. She waited until the meeting broke up, until Jed and the other men had dispersed. Then, she slipped into the saloon, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She found the table where they had been sitting, and there, tucked beneath a discarded newspaper, she found a small, folded piece of paper. It was a note, written in Jed's distinctive handwriting, outlining the plan for the attack, including the date, the time, and the specific targets. It was the proof she needed, the irrefutable evidence of Jed's betrayal. She quickly pocketed the note, her hand trembling with a mixture of relief and fear. She had to get back to Boone, to warn him before it was too late. She slipped out of the saloon, unnoticed, and made her way back to the ranch, her mind racing, her heart heavy with the weight of her discovery. As she approached the ranch house, she saw Boone standing on the porch, his figure silhouetted against the light from the windows. He looked worried, his eyes scanning the darkness, as if expecting trouble. She ran towards him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Mr. Boone," she called out, her voice urgent. "We have to talk." "It's Jed, he's working with the rustlers." Boone turned, his eyes startled, his expression shifting from concern to disbelief. "What are you talking about, Will?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Jed's been with me for years. I trust him." Winnie knew she had to convince him, to make him believe her. She pulled out the note, her hand trembling as she handed it to him. "I found this," she said, her voice breathless. "It's his handwriting. It's the plan for the attack.
He's betraying you."
Boone took the note, his eyes scanning the words, his expression hardening with each line he read. He looked up at Winnie, his face a mask of anger and disbelief. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Winnie hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't reveal her true identity, not yet. She had to maintain the charade, at least for a little while longer. I followed him," she stammered. "I saw him meeting with the rustlers. I found it in the saloon." Boone studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, trying to discern the truth. He seemed to be struggling to reconcile her words with his own long-held beliefs, his own trust in Jed. "I don't know what to believe," he said, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "But I can't ignore this. Not after what happened with those rustlers before." He looked around. "Round up the other hands and tell them to meet in the barn. I have to have all the facts." He trusted her, at least enough to investigate. That was all Winnie needed. The price of her freedom, her disguise, might be about to be paid, but the ranch and Boone might be saved. The wind whipped around them, a tangible representation of the turmoil within her and the storm that was about to break over the ranch. Chapter 12. A Reckoning Under the Desert Moon. The atmosphere in the barn was thick with tension, the air heavy with suspicion and uncertainty. The ranch hands, assembled at Boone's command, stood in a loose circle, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of lanterns, their eyes darting between Boone, Winnie, and Jed. Boone stood in the center, his face grim, his body taut, the incriminating note clutched in his hand. He looked at Jed, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Jed," he said, his voice low and steady, "I've been presented with some disturbing information. Information that suggests you've been working with the rustlers, betraying my trust, endangering this ranch." Jed, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear, stammered a denial. "Mr. Boone, I swear I don't know what you're talking about." "I would never." Boone cut him off, his voice sharp and unforgiving. "Don't lie to me, Jed," he said. "I have proof. This note, it's in your handwriting. It outlines the plan for an attack on this ranch. An attack you helped orchestrate." He held up the note, the damning evidence visible to everyone. Jed's face crumbled, his denials dissolving into a whimper of fear. "I can explain," he stammered. They forced me. They threatened my family. I had no choice." Boone shook his head, his eyes filled with disgust. "There's always a choice, Jed," he said. "You chose to betray me, to betray all of us. You chose to side with thieves and murderers." The other hands murmured amongst themselves, their faces a mixture of anger, disbelief, and fear. They had trusted Jed, had worked alongside him for years. The revelation of his betrayal was a shock, a violation of their shared bond. Winnie stood silently, watching the scene unfold, her heart aching for Boone, for the pain he was enduring. She had exposed Jed, had brought the truth to light, but it had come at a cost. The trust that had slowly been building on the ranch was shattered, replaced by suspicion and fear. Boone turned to Winnie, his eyes searching hers. "Will," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "you brought this to my attention. You risked your own safety to uncover this treachery. I owe you a debt of gratitude." His words, his praise, sent a wave of guilt through her. She had done the right thing, but she had done it under false pretenses. She was still living a lie, still hiding her true identity. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of remorse and longing. "I only did what was right," she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. Boone nodded, his expression softening slightly. He seemed to see something in her eyes, something that transcended her disguise, something that spoke to her true character. He turned back to Jed, his face hardening again. "Jed," he said, his voice cold and resolute, "you're finished here. Get off my land, and never come back. If I ever see you again, I'll kill you." Jed, his face contorted with fear, stumbled out of the barn, his departure leaving a void in the tense atmosphere. Boone turned to the remaining hands, his voice firm and commanding. "We'll double the patrols," he said. "We'll be ready for them. We'll protect this ranch, no matter the cost." The hands nodded, their faces grim and determined. They had been betrayed, but they would not be defeated. They would stand together, fight together, defend their home. As the meeting dispersed, Boone turned to Winnie, his eyes lingering on her face. "Will," he said, his voice softer now, I need to talk to you. Alone." Winnie's heart skipped a beat. She knew this was it. The moment of truth. The reckoning. She followed him out of the barn, into the cool night air, the desert moon casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. They walked in silence for a few moments, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Boone stopped, turning to face her, his eyes searching hers in the pale moonlight. "There's something I don't understand," he said, his voice low and troubled. "How did you know? How did you find that note? How did you become so skilled with a gun?" Winnie hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't lie any longer, not to him. The truth, like the desert moon, was about to be revealed. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest, and began to speak, the words tumbling out, a torrent of confession and revelation. The wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting as the secrets of the heiress in disguise were finally unveiled under the vast, uncaring sky. Chapter 13. The Unraveling of Secrets. "My name," Winnie began, her voice trembling, the words catching in her throat, "is not Will. It's Winona. Winona Tate." Boone stared at her, his eyes widening in disbelief, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. He looked as though he'd been struck by lightning, his body stiff and unmoving. "Tate?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper, the name seeming to hang in the air between them. "As in the Tates?" Winnie nodded, her eyes filling with tears, the weight of her deception finally crashing down on her. "Yes," she confessed. "I'm the daughter of Henry Tate, the heiress to the Tate cattle empire." Boone took a step back, his hand going to his forehead, as if trying to process the information, to reconcile the image of the young, seemingly inexperienced ranch hand with the reality of a wealthy heiress.
"But why?"
he asked, his voice filled with bewilderment. Why would you do this? Why would you pretend to be someone you're not?" Winnie looked down, unable to meet his gaze, ashamed of her deception, of the lies she had told. I wanted to escape," she explained, her voice choked with emotion. "I wanted to be free from the expectations, the constraints, the gilded cage I was trapped in." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I wanted to prove myself," she continued, "to prove that I was more than just a name, more than just an heiress. I wanted to experience life, real life, not the artificial world I was born into. Boone listened in silence, his expression slowly shifting from disbelief to a dawning comprehension. He began to see the truth in her words, the desperation that had driven her, the longing for freedom that had propelled her on this reckless journey. "And the gun?" he asked, his voice softer now, his anger subsiding, replaced by a hesitant curiosity. "You said you weren't experienced, but you handled yourself like you had training." Winnie nodded. "I did," she confessed. "My father's old stable master, he taught me to ride, to shoot. Secretly, of course. It wasn't considered appropriate for a woman of my station." Boone let out a long, slow breath, his body relaxing slightly. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and something else. Something akin to understanding, perhaps even forgiveness. "You're a remarkable woman, Winona Tate," he said, his voice low and husky, the sound of her real name sending a shiver through her. "You're braver, stronger, more resourceful than anyone I've ever met, man or woman." His words, his praise, washed over her, a balm to her wounded soul. She had been afraid of his anger, his rejection, but instead, she found acceptance, understanding, even respect. "But why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice still tinged with confusion. "Why keep up the charade, even after everything that happened?" Winnie hesitated, her heart aching with the truth. I was afraid," she confessed. "Afraid of what you would think, of how you would react." And I started to, she couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't bring herself to say the words, to confess her feelings for him. It was too soon, too raw, too vulnerable. Boone looked at her, his eyes searching hers, his gaze intense. He seemed to understand, to see the unspoken words in her eyes, the emotions she couldn't articulate. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers brushing away a stray tear. "Winona," he said, his voice soft and tender, "you don't have to be afraid. Not with me." His touch, his words, sent a wave of warmth through her, a feeling of hope, of possibility. The secrets were out, the deception unraveled, but instead of destruction, she found a fragile beginning, a glimmer of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. The moon, a silent witness to their confession, seemed to shine brighter, illuminating a path forward, a path fraught with uncertainty, but also with the promise of something real, something true. The wind whispered her name, Winona, and for the first time, it sounded like a promise, not a burden. Chapter 14. Where Trust Lies Bleeding. The revelation of Winnie's true identity sent ripples through the ranch, the news spreading like wildfire among the hands. Some were shocked, some were disbelieving, some were angry, feeling betrayed by the deception. The fragile trust that had been built was shattered, replaced by suspicion and uncertainty. Boone, despite his initial shock, stood by Winnie, defending her, explaining her motives, trying to quell the unrest. He understood her yearning for freedom, her desire to prove herself, and he admired her courage, her resilience. But he also knew that winning back the trust of the other hands would be a difficult, uphill battle. Winnie, stripped of her disguise, felt vulnerable and exposed. She was no longer Will, the unassuming ranch hand. She was Winona Tate, the heiress, a woman out of place, a stranger in a world she had desperately tried to belong to. She felt the weight of their judgment, their suspicion, and it was a heavy burden to bear. She tried to make amends, to prove that she was still the same person, despite her different name and background. She continued to work hard, to contribute to the ranch, to show that she wasn't afraid of getting her hands dirty. But it was difficult, the chasm between her and the other hands seemingly insurmountable. One evening, as she was walking back from the stables, she was confronted by a group of the hands, their faces grim, their eyes filled with resentment. "So you're a fancy lady, huh?" One of them sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Playing at being a ranch hand. What was it all about? A game? A thrill?" Winnie met their gaze, her chin held high, her eyes filled with defiance. "It wasn't a game," she said, her voice steady. I came here to find myself, to prove myself. I wanted to be more than just a name, more than just an heiress. And you think you did that? Another hand challenged. By lying to us? By deceiving us? Winnie hesitated, her confidence faltering. She knew she had hurt them, had betrayed their trust. I know I made mistakes, she admitted. I know I hurt you. But I never meant to cause any harm. Harm? The first hand scoffed. You put us all at risk. You could have gotten us killed. We trusted you. And you lied to us. Winnie felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had been so focused on her own journey, her own desires, that she hadn't fully considered the consequences of her actions, the impact on the others. She looked down, unable to meet their accusing eyes. I'm sorry, she mumbled, her voice barely a whisper. Boone appeared then, his presence commanding, his voice sharp. That's enough, he said, his eyes scanning the group, his gaze settling on each man in turn. Miss Tate has explained herself. She made a mistake, yes, but she also risked her life to save this ranch, to save your lives. She deserves your respect, not your scorn. The hands, chastened by Boone's words, shuffled their feet, their anger subsiding, replaced by a grudging acceptance. They dispersed, leaving Winnie and Boone alone. Boone turned to Winnie, his expression softening. They'll come around, he said, his voice reassuring. It just takes time. Trust is a fragile thing, easily broken, hard to repair. But it can be done. Winnie looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she said, her voice sincere. For standing by me. For believing in me. Boone nodded, his eyes lingering on her face. I do believe in you, Winona, he said, his voice low and husky. I see who you are beneath the disguise, beneath the name. And he hesitated, his voice trailing off, his gaze searching hers. He seemed to be struggling with his own emotions, his own unspoken feelings. The air between them was thick with tension, the silence punctuated by the sounds of the night. The moon, a silent witness, cast its pale light on them, illuminating the fragile bond that was forming, a bond built on shared danger, mutual respect, and something more, something deeper, something that was still unspoken, but undeniable. Trust lay bleeding, wounded by deception, but not broken. And in its place, something new, something fragile but powerful, was beginning to grow. The wind whispered a question, a challenge, and a promise, all intertwined. Chapter 15. Echoes of a Forgotten Promise. The days following the confrontation with the ranch hands were filled with a quiet tension, a sense of rebuilding, of slowly piecing together the shattered fragments of trust. Winnie worked tirelessly, determined to prove her worth, to earn back the respect she had lost. She threw herself into the most demanding tasks, her hands becoming blistered and calloused, her body aching with exhaustion, but her spirit unwavering. Boone watched her, his admiration growing with each passing day. He saw her resilience, her determination, her unwavering commitment to the ranch, and it deepened his feelings for her, feelings that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. He found himself seeking her out, drawn to her quiet strength, her unwavering spirit. He started to share his thoughts, his concerns, his plans for the ranch, treating her as an equal, a partner, not just a hired hand, or even an heiress. One evening, as they were sitting by the campfire, sharing a simple meal, Boone started to talk about his past, about his life before he came to the ranch. It was a rare glimpse into his guarded heart, a sharing of secrets he had kept buried for years. I wasn't always a rancher, he confessed, his voice low and hesitant, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. I had a different life, a different dream. I was engaged to be married once. To a woman I loved more than anything in the world. Winnie listened in silence, her heart aching for him, her curiosity piqued. She had sensed a deep sadness within him, a hidden pain, and now she was beginning to understand its source. Her name was Sarah, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. She was everything to me. Beautiful, kind, full of life. We were going to build a life together, a family. We had it all planned. He paused, his gaze drifting to the distant horizon, his eyes filled with a haunting sorrow. "But it wasn't meant to be," he said, his voice barely a whisper.
She died.
"Of a fever. Just a few weeks before our wedding." Winnie reached out and gently touched his hand, her heart filled with compassion. "I'm so sorry, Travis," she said, her voice soft and sincere. I can't imagine the pain you must have felt." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. "It broke me," he confessed. "I lost everything. My hope, my future, my reason for living." He turned away, his shoulders slumping, his body radiating a sense of profound loss. "I left everything behind," he continued. "I wandered for years, trying to escape the pain, trying to find a reason to keep going. I ended up here, on this ranch, and I built a new life, a new wall around my heart." Winnie understood. She, too, had run away, had tried to escape her past, had sought solace in a new identity. She had found a measure of peace, a sense of purpose, but the echoes of her old life, like Boone's, still lingered. "But you did find a reason," she said, her voice filled with hope. "You built this ranch. You created a life for yourself. You found a way to carry on." Boone nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I did," he agreed. "But it wasn't easy. And I never forgot her. I never stopped loving her." He looked at Winnie, his eyes searching hers. "Until now," he said, his voice low and husky, the words hanging in the air between them. Winnie's heart skipped a beat. She understood the unspoken meaning behind his words, the confession he was making. He was falling in love with her, just as she was falling in love with him. The echoes of a forgotten promise, of a love lost, were fading, replaced by the promise of a new love, a new beginning. The campfire crackled, the flames dancing in the night, illuminating the faces of two wounded souls, finding solace in each other's company, finding hope in the shared vulnerability of their hearts. The wind whispered a melody of healing, of second chances, of a love that was blossoming in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the West. Chapter 16. The Thin Veil of a Lie. Even as love blossomed between Winnie and Boone, a shadow of unease remained. While Jed had been exposed and banished, the threat of the rustlers still loomed, a constant reminder of the dangers that surrounded them. Boone, driven by a fierce protectiveness, both for his ranch and for Winnie, insisted on heightened security, his vigilance unwavering. Winnie, however, felt a growing unease of a different kind. While the major deception of her identity was revealed, a smaller, more subtle lie persisted. She hadn't told Boone the entire truth about how she acquired the incriminating note from Jed. She had said she found it, omitting the fact that she had actively sought it out, that she had deliberately put herself in danger by entering the saloon, a place no respectable woman, especially an heiress, would dare to venture. This omission, this small, persistent lie, gnawed at her conscience. She knew Boone valued honesty, that he had built his life on a foundation of integrity and trust. And while she had confessed to the larger deception, this remaining secret felt like a betrayal, a crack in the foundation of their burgeoning relationship. She tried to rationalize it, to convince herself that it was a minor detail, that it didn't matter. She had protected Boone, had saved the ranch, and that was all that mattered. But the lie persisted, a thorn in her side, a constant reminder of her imperfection. One afternoon, while they were riding together, checking the fence lines, Boone brought up the subject of Jed again. "I still can't believe he betrayed me," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and bewilderment. "After all these years, I trusted him." Winnie felt a pang of guilt, her conscience screaming at her to confess. "I know," she said, her voice hesitant. It's hard to understand." Boone looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "You were right about him, Winona," he said. "You saw something I didn't. You have good instincts." Winnie forced a smile, trying to hide her discomfort. I just got lucky, I guess," she mumbled. "Luck had nothing to do with it," Boone countered, his voice firm. "You were brave, resourceful. You risked your life to get that note. I'm still amazed by how you managed to define it. His words, meant as praise, felt like an accusation. The lie, like a thin veil, seemed to be suffocating her. She couldn't bear it any longer. She reined in her horse, her heart pounding in her chest. "Travis," she said, her voice trembling, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you before." Boone stopped his horse, his eyes filled with concern. "What is it, Winona?" he asked, his voice gentle. "What's wrong?" She took a deep breath, steeling herself for his reaction. I didn't just find the note," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I went into the saloon. I saw Jed meeting with the rustlers. I deliberately looked for evidence." Boone stared at her, his expression shifting from concern to disbelief, then to a flicker of anger. "You what?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "You went into that saloon? Alone? Are you insane?" Winnie looked down, unable to meet his gaze, ashamed of her recklessness. "I had to," she explained. "I had to get proof. I had to stop them." "You could have been killed," Boone exclaimed, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and fear. "That was a foolish, reckless thing to do. You put yourself in unnecessary danger." Winnie nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I know," she admitted. "I know it was dangerous. But I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. I had to protect you, to protect the ranch." Boone dismounted, his movements stiff and controlled. He walked towards her, his eyes searching hers. "Winona," he said, his voice softer now, but still laced with concern, "I appreciate your courage, your loyalty. But you have to understand you can't just take risks like that. Not without telling me. Not without considering the consequences." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers brushing away a stray tear. "I care about you, Winona," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "I don't want to lose you. Not like I lost Sarah." His words, his vulnerability, pierced her heart. She saw the fear in his eyes, the echo of his past trauma, and she realized the depth of his feelings for her. She also saw the hurt caused by her lie, the small crack it had created in their trust. "I'm sorry, Travis," she said, her voice choked with remorse. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you. I was afraid of your reaction. I didn't want you to think less of me." Boone sighed, his anger subsiding, replaced by a weary understanding. "Winona," he said, his voice gentle, "honesty is everything to me. It's the foundation of any relationship, any trust. You need to be honest with me, always. No matter how difficult, no matter how afraid you are." He pulled her into a hug. "I love you," he whispered. Winnie closed her eyes, letting the words and feelings envelope her. The thin veil of the lie was gone, ripped away by confession and remorse. The truth, raw and exposed, lay between them, a challenge and a promise. The wind, a constant presence, whispered a lesson, a reminder that even the smallest deception can have profound consequences. And in the vast, open landscape of the West, honesty, like the fragile bond between two hearts, was the only thing that could truly endure. Chapter 17. A flame in the gathering darkness. With the final layer of deception peeled away, a sense of relief washed over Winnie, a lightness she hadn't realized she was missing. The air between her and Boone felt clearer, the unspoken tension dissipating, replaced by a deeper, more profound connection. They had weathered a storm of lies and secrets, and their bond, though tested, had emerged stronger, more resilient. Boone, while initially angered by Winnie's recklessness, ultimately understood her motives, her fierce loyalty, her unwavering determination to protect him and the ranch. He admired her courage, even as he worried about her safety. He knew he had to find a way to channel her bravery, to harness her skills, while also ensuring her protection. He started to include her in the strategic planning for the ranch's defense, recognizing her intelligence, her keen observation skills, her intuitive understanding of people. He valued her input, her perspective, treating her as an equal partner in the fight against the rustlers. Winnie, empowered by Boone's trust and acceptance, blossomed. She was no longer playing a role, pretending to be someone she wasn't. She was Winona Tate, a woman of strength, intelligence, and courage, using her skills and resources to protect the man she loved and the life she had chosen. She began to train with the other hands, honing her riding and shooting skills, becoming a formidable force in her own right. She learned to read the signs of the land, to anticipate danger, to strategize and plan. She was no longer a liability, a burden. She was an asset, a valuable member of the team. One evening, as they were preparing for a night patrol, Boone presented Winnie with a gift. It was a rifle, a beautiful, custom-made weapon, engraved with her initials. "This is for you, Winona," he said, his voice filled with pride and affection. "You've earned it. You're a natural. A true Western woman." Winnie was deeply touched, her eyes filling with tears. It was more than just a gift, it was a symbol of his acceptance, his trust, his love. She took the rifle, her hand trembling slightly, feeling the weight of its responsibility, the power it represented. "Thank you, Travis," she said, her voice choked with emotion. I won't let you down." Boone smiled, his eyes lingering on her face. "I know you won't," he said, his voice confident and reassuring. As they rode out together, under the vast, starlit sky, Winnie felt a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. She was no longer running from her past, she was embracing her future, a future filled with danger, yes, but also with love, with partnership, with the possibility of building a life with the man she loved. The threat of the rustlers still loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon, but Winnie was no longer afraid. She was armed, she was prepared, and she was surrounded by people she trusted, people who respected her, people who would fight alongside her. A flame had been ignited within her, a fire of courage, determination, and love. It was a flame that would not be easily extinguished, a flame that would guide her through the gathering darkness, a flame that would illuminate her path towards a future she had once only dreamed of. The wind, a constant companion, whispered encouragement, a promise of strength, a testament to the power of love and resilience in the face of adversity. Chapter 18. The Cost of a Second Chance. The anticipated attack from the rustlers finally came, a brutal assault under the cover of darkness, a desperate attempt to steal Boone's cattle and cripple his ranch. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, shouts, and the terrified bellows of the panicked animals. Boone, Winnie, and the other hands fought fiercely, defending their home, their livelihood, their lives. The training they had undergone, the strategies they had planned, were put to the test, the battle a chaotic dance of death and survival. Winnie, armed with her new rifle, fought with a courage and skill that surprised even herself. She was no longer the pampered heiress, the disguised ranch hand. She was a warrior, a protector, a woman fighting for what she believed in, for the man she loved. She moved with a fluid grace, her shots precise and deadly, her instincts honed by weeks of training and the adrenaline-fueled urgency of the moment. She saw Boone, his face grim and determined, his rifle blazing, his movements a blur of controlled fury. She fought her way towards him, her heart pounding in her chest, her fear overshadowed by a fierce protectiveness. They fought side by side, their movements synchronized, their trust in each other absolute. They were a formidable team, a force to be reckoned with, their combined strength greater than the sum of their individual parts. But the rustlers were numerous, desperate, and well-armed. They pressed their attack, their numbers overwhelming, their brutality shocking. One of the hands, a young man named Ben, who had been particularly skeptical of Winnie, was shot, his body falling to the ground with a sickening thud. Winnie saw him fall, her heart clenching with grief and anger. She had come to know Ben, to respect him, despite his initial doubts. His death was a stark reminder of the cost of this fight, the price of freedom, the fragility of life. She fought on, her determination fueled by a renewed sense of purpose, a fierce resolve to avenge Ben's death, to protect Boone, to defend the ranch they had both come to love. The battle raged for what seemed like an eternity, the night filled with the sounds of violence, the the smell of gunpowder, the cries of the wounded. Slowly, gradually, the tide began to turn. Boone and Winnie, along with the remaining hands, fought with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. The rustlers, their numbers dwindling, their attack faltering, began to retreat, their hopes of victory dashed. As the last of the rustlers fled, a heavy silence descended upon the ranch, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the exhausted sobs of the survivors. The cost of the victory was high. Several hands were injured, some seriously, and Ben was dead. Boone, his face covered in dust and blood, his body weary, walked towards Winnie, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. He reached out and took her hand, his grip tight and reassuring. "We did it, Winona," he said, his voice hoarse. "We won. But at what cost?" Winnie looked at him, her own eyes filled with tears. She saw the pain in his face, the weight of the losses they had suffered, and she knew that the victory, though hard-won, was bittersweet. They had survived, they had protected the ranch, but they had also paid a heavy price. The second chance they had both been given, the opportunity to build a new life, a new love, had come at a cost. The scars of the battle, both physical and emotional, would remain, a constant reminder of the dangers they faced, the fragility of their newfound happiness. The moon, obscured by clouds, seemed to reflect their somber mood, the darkness a stark contrast to the flame of hope that still flickered within their hearts. The wind, a mournful sigh, whispered a lament for the fallen, and a prayer for the future. Chapter 19. The Heart's Uncharted Territory. In the aftermath of the battle, the ranch slowly began to heal, both physically and emotionally. The wounded were tended to, the dead were buried, and the work of rebuilding began. The sense of loss was palpable, the absence of Ben a constant reminder of the violence they had endured, but there was also a sense of resilience, a determination to move forward, to honor the sacrifices that had been made. Winnie and Boone, their bond forged in the crucible of conflict, found themselves drawn even closer, their love deepening, their commitment to each other unwavering. They had faced death together, had fought side by side, and that shared experience had created a connection that transcended words, a profound understanding that went beyond the superficial. They spent hours together, talking, planning, dreaming of a future they could build together, a future free from danger, a future filled with love, family, and the quiet joys of ranch life. They explored the uncharted territory of their hearts, discovering new depths of affection, new layers of understanding, new possibilities for happiness. Boone, his heart once closed off by grief and loss, began to open up, to embrace the possibility of love again. He saw in Winnie a kindred spirit, a woman of strength, courage, and compassion, a woman who had not only saved his ranch, but had also awakened his heart. Winnie, freed from the burden of her disguise, blossomed. She was no longer pretending to be someone she wasn't. She was simply Winona, a woman deeply in love with a man who saw her, accepted her, and cherished her for who she truly was. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, Boone turned to Winnie, his eyes filled with a tenderness she had never seen before. "Winona," he said, his voice low and husky, I love you. I love you more than words can say. You've brought light back into my life, hope back into my heart. You've given me a reason to live again." Winnie's heart overflowed with emotion, her eyes filling with tears of joy. She had longed to hear those words, had dreamed of this moment, and now that it was here, it was even more beautiful, more profound than she had ever imagined. "I love you too, Travis," she confessed, her voice trembling with emotion. "I love you with all my heart. You've shown me what it means to be strong, to be brave, to be truly alive." Boone reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their future together. The kiss was a promise, a vow, a testament to the power of love to heal, to transform, to overcome even the greatest obstacles. It was a celebration of their shared journey, their hard-won victory, their enduring bond. As they held each other, the vast Texas sky above them seemed to echo their love, the stars twinkling like diamonds, the moon a silent witness to their happiness. The wind, a gentle caress, whispered a blessing, a song of hope, a promise of a future filled with love, laughter, and the quiet joys of a life lived together, a life built on trust, respect, and an unwavering devotion. The uncharted territory of their hearts had been explored, mapped, and claimed, and the journey, though fraught with danger and uncertainty, had led them to a place of profound and enduring love. They still faced uncertainty about what lay ahead, but one truth was brilliantly clear: their love. Chapter 20. Redemption in the Setting Sun. The threat of the rustlers, though diminished, had not entirely disappeared. While their major attack had been thwarted, smaller skirmishes and incidents of cattle theft continued to plague the region, a constant reminder of the lawlessness that still permeated the West. Boone, ever vigilant, continued to patrol the ranch, to protect his property and his people, but he also recognized the need for a more permanent solution, a way to bring lasting peace and security to the area. He decided to take matters into his own hands, to seek out the remaining rustlers, to bring them to justice, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of the entire community. He knew it was a dangerous undertaking, a risky gamble, but he felt a responsibility, a duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. Winnie, though worried about his safety, supported his decision. She knew that he wouldn't be content to simply sit back and wait for the next attack, that he needed to take action, to confront the threat head-on. She offered to ride with him, to stand by his side, but he refused, his love for her overriding his desire for her help. "No, Winona," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "This is something I have to do alone. I can't risk your life, not again. You need to stay here, to keep the ranch safe, to be ready for anything." Winnie, though disappointed, understood his reasoning. She knew that he was trying to protect her, that his love for her was the driving force behind his decision. She reluctantly agreed, her heart heavy with worry, but her trust in him unwavering. Boone rode out at dawn, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape, his heart filled with a mixture of determination and apprehension. He tracked the rustlers for days, following their trail across the rugged terrain, his skills as a tracker honed by years of experience. He finally found them, holed up in a remote canyon, their camp a collection of makeshift tents and stolen supplies. He knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, but he was determined to confront them, to bring them to justice. He approached their camp stealthily, his rifle ready, his senses on high alert. He surprised them, catching them off guard, their guard down. A fierce gunfight erupted, the canyon echoing with the sounds of gunfire, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder. Boone fought with a courage and skill born of desperation and a deep-seated sense of justice. He took down several of the rustlers, his shots precise and deadly, but he was also wounded, a bullet grazing his arm, another piercing his side. He stumbled, his body weakened by the loss of blood, but he refused to give up. He fought on, his determination fueled by his love for Winnie, his commitment to the ranch, his unwavering belief in justice. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the last of the rustlers were either killed or captured. Boone, wounded and exhausted, stood alone amidst the carnage, his victory hard-won, his body aching, his spirit weary. He slowly made his way back to the ranch, his horse carrying him, his strength failing. Winnie, who had been anxiously awaiting his return, saw him approaching, his figure slumped in the saddle, his clothes stained with blood. She ran towards him, her heart pounding with fear, her eyes filled with tears. She helped him dismount, her arms supporting his weakened body, her voice filled with concern. "Travis," she cried, "you're hurt. What happened?" Boone managed a weak smile, his eyes filled with love and relief. "I'm all right, Winona," he said, his voice hoarse. "I did it. It's over. The rustlers are gone." Winnie helped him into the house, tending to his wounds, her touch gentle and caring, her love a healing balm to his battered body and spirit. As she cared for him, she realized the depth of her love, the strength of her commitment, the unwavering bond that had been forged between them. In the days that followed, Boone slowly recovered, his wounds healing, his strength returning. The news of his victory spread throughout the region, bringing a sense of relief and hope to the community. He was hailed as a hero, a man who had risked his life to bring justice to the lawless West. As the sun set on their lives, casting a golden glow over the ranch, Winnie and Boone stood together, their hands clasped, their hearts filled with love, gratitude, and a profound sense of peace. They had faced danger, deception, and loss, but they had emerged stronger, their love a beacon of hope in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. They had found redemption in the setting sun, a promise of a future filled with love, family, and the quiet joys of a life built on trust, respect, and an unwavering devotion. The wind, a gentle whisper, carried a song of triumph, a celebration of their love, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Their journey was far from over, but they would face it together, hand in hand, hearts intertwined. Epilogue. Years passed and the Boone Ranch prospered. The once rough landscape softened under Winnie's touch, the ranch house transforming into a home filled with laughter, love, and the patter of little feet. Children, 2 boys and a girl, with Boone's eyes and Winnie's spirit, ran through the fields, their joyous cries echoing across the plains, a testament to the enduring power of love and family. Winnie, no longer the disguised heiress, but the matriarch of a thriving ranch, found a fulfillment she had never dreamed possible. She embraced her new life, her new identity, with a grace and strength that surprised even herself. She was a wife, a mother, a partner, and a respected member of the community, her past a distant memory, a stepping stone to the woman she had become. Boone, his heart healed, his spirit renewed, found a peace he had long sought. He cherished Winnie and their children, his love for them a constant source of strength and joy. He was a rancher, a husband, a father, and a leader, his past a reminder of the hardships he had overcome, the resilience he had cultivated. The scars of the past remained, both physical and emotional, a reminder of the dangers they had faced, the losses they had endured. But the scars were also a testament to their strength, their courage, their unwavering commitment to each other. They were proof that even in the harshest of landscapes, love could blossom, families could thrive, and second chances could be realized. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching their children play in the fading light, Boone turned to Winnie, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "You know, Winona," he said, his voice soft and tender, "you were right. I wasn't running from something when I came here. I was running towards something. I was running towards you." Winnie smiled, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, their bond as strong as ever. "And I," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "was running towards you too. Towards this life, this family, this love." They sat in silence for a moment, their hands clasped, their hearts content, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange, purple, and gold. The colors mirrored the richness of their lives, the beauty of their love, the enduring legacy they had created. The wind, a gentle whisper, carried a song of contentment, a celebration of their journey, a testament to the power of love to conquer all, to heal all, to redeem all. The West, once a symbol of danger and uncertainty, had become their home, their sanctuary, their paradise. And in the heart of that vast, untamed landscape, they had found a love that was as enduring as the mountains, as vast as the sky, as timeless as the setting sun. Their story, a legend whispered on the wind, a tale of courage, deception, and ultimately, of a love that defied